In this comparative study, I'll explore the similarities and differences between the two lyricists, namely Paul the Deacon and Camille Saint-Saëns' attitude on nature, by examining Paul's poem To Lake Como and the second movement of Saint-Saëns' violin concerto in B minor, opus 61, Andantino. In both of the lyrical pieces, the artists hold a complex attitude on nature. Both Paul the Deacon and Saint-Saëns exploit nature's tenderness and beauty through depictions of Italian pastoral sceneries and acknowledge the danger of indulging in such allure through the occasional tension in their works. While Paul and Saint-Saëns make clear that nature, or rather the personal feeling elicited by natural imageries, can deviate them from the higher motivation, both artists' struggle against their own emotion proves futile, which is hinted at the end of their work. To see the stunning similarities between the poem and the violin concerto, we need to first reconcile their differences, since these two lyrical works reside in very different geographical and temporal spaces. To the Lake Como by Paul the Deacon is a Latin epitaph dedicated to a northern Italian lake named Como. Paul wrote the epitaph after he fled the Benevento court and entered as a monk in a monastery by the lake. While Paul is usually known for his historical and hagiographical works related to Charlemagne's court, To Lake Como is arguably one of the best Carolingian poems, and is representative of his lyrical power. However, as noted by Joseph Pucci in his paper, Pied Beauty, Paul the Deacon's poem To Lake Como. To Lake Como as a poem is not very well examined by academia. The title that the German editor Ernst Dummler left it, Versus in Laudolari Laci, gives reader the false impression that the poem is a simple encomium piece dedicated to the beautiful Italian lake, and ignores the underlying tension that Paul conveys through the classical references throughout the poem. Similar to the underappreciation that the Latin academia shows to Paul the Deacon's lyrical piece, Saint-Saëns' violin concerto in B minor is also left underanalyzed by the musicologist in terms of its motivation. Written in 1880, the work is French composer's third violin concerto, and he dedicated the work to the famous Spanish violinist Sarasate, who also premiered the piece as its solo violinist. The timing of the composition places the work in a turbulent landscape in both music history and Saint-Saëns' personal life. As a child prodigy, Saint-Saëns composed his piece with great facility. However, as an artist, he chose to stand aloof from the prevailing subjectivism of 19th and early 20th century Romanticism, which still fuels our fascination with the emotionally embattled composer, such as Mahler and Tchaikovsky, who pour private feeling into works at once public and personal. Saint-Saëns once famously claimed that art is intended to create beauty and character. Feeling comes afterwards, and art can very well do without it. Although the composer lost his two sons and had a sour end of his marriage around the time of the composition of this concerto, his impersonal approach to music explains why his audience will not possibly conceive any of the personal tragedies and turmoils that he experienced. On June the 15th, 1900, Saint-Saëns attended the Panama Pacific International Exposition. In his address to the attendees of the French Idea Fair, Saint-Saëns disapproved the modern execution of ancient music and further criticized some of his contemporaries for distorting the traditional musical techniques, such as vibrato. To give a counterexample to the excessive liberty that some of his fellow musicians take, he brought up Sarasate and his interpretation of the violin concerto in B minor. I have written a concerto, the first and last movements of which are very passionate. They are separated by a movement of the greatest calm, a lake between two mountains. Those great violin players who do me the honor to play this piece do not understand the contrast, and they vibrate on the lake just as they do on the mountains. Sarasate, for whom this concerto was written, was as calm on the lake as he was agitated on the mountains. Nor did he fail on this account to produce always a great effect, for there is nothing like giving to music its veritable character. The first movement and the third movement of the concerto, or the mountains in Saint-Saëns' words, are written in French and Spanish style, while the lake, or the second movement of the concerto, is written based off a simple Siciliano melody, thus places the piece in an Italian bucolic landscape similar to the one of To Lake Como. Unlike the wistful lake in Tchaikovsky's Melody and the melancholy Black Sea in Ovid's Ex Pontus, both the Lake Como in Paul the Deacon's poem and Saint-Saëns' lakes are depicted as locus amoenus, where nature is put at the forefront. In To Lake Como, Paul the Deacon declares such nature-centric focus by asking the question how I should describe your greatness, and addresses the lake directly in the first line of the poem. Such move differentiates the poem from many other pastoral works written in the early medieval or late antiquity period, where nature became a token for friendship and imperial power. In lines 3 to 16, the poet emphasizes the bountiness of the lake and praises it for its everlasting beauty. Described as the lake's magnificus, the imageries of pomegranate and olive trees and the word hortus links straight back to Virgil's Georgics, where nature is represented as a wild and energetic force that should be tamed by human intervention. The syntax of lines 7 to 8 should further remind readers of Alcuin's characterization of his cella in his personal poem, where the cell that enjoys everlasting spring becomes a token of Alcuin's poetic career in the Carolingian court. While Paul the Deacon manages to cultivate the beauty and abundance of Lake Como with classical allusions, Saint-Saëns also jumps straight into the Sicilian tune and ends up constructing a space larger than Paul's Lake Como. While Paul the Deacon puts an emphasis on the myriads of natural objects around the lake, such as the olive forests and the citrus trees, Saint-Saëns is more interested in the water itself. Dividing the second movement of the concerto in three, in the first part, Saint-Saëns gives the main motif of the music. In the first 50 bars, the audience can hear a back and forth between the solo violin and the flute, and such correspondence between the two instruments gives the music a sense of playfulness, as if the audience are sitting in an idle boat, drifting towards the setting sun. The repetition of such melodies throughout the first 50 bars of the music, and later its mutation in the last part of the music, renders the musical sentences of the work with a childlike sensation. Such childishness reminds me of the 20th century French philosopher Gaston Bachelard's comment in his work Waters and Dreams. Laughing waters, ironic streams, waterfalls with their noisy gaiety. These babblings are, it seems, the childhood language of nature. In the stream, the child nature speaks. Different from the Virgilian aesthetics that Paul inherits, where nature can be destructive because of its vibrance, Saint-Saëns' conception of nature is innocent yet dynamic. The water into Lake Como may help to irrigate all the diverse plants around the lake. However, Paul the Deacon deviates from the example that his literary forebear Ausonius sets in the Appian Moselle and decides not to give his readers too much description of the water itself. In contrast, Saint-Saëns' focus on the playfulness of the water ends up creating a more personal image of the lake and a more intimate relationship between nature and his audience. While we recognize Lake Como's relatively distant relationship with people, upon second examination of the classical allusions in the poem, we may find out why such aloofness exists. Referring back to Pucci's Pied Beauty, a strong sense of terror and danger actually lie under many seemingly innocent analogies in the Lake Como poem. The Cornua Panda in line 3, when put in an Ovidian context and related with the myth of Pygmalion and the sacrifice to Venus, suddenly makes the horn-shaped Lake Como a threatening deception and a token of unattainable pleasure. The verse Ver tibi semper innest points to a key scene in the 6th book of Aeneid, during which Aeneas saw a fictitious Troy in the tomb of Hector in the underworld, and the hero describes the scene as viridi inanem, which means a green vision. The more concerning part of Paul's analogy comes when he uses a stanza of catalog, where he calls upon several sinister waters, such as the dark entrance to hell, Avernus, Epirus, which may refer to the lake Dracolimni in the Epirus region, and the lake Fucinus, where in linkage to Aeneas 7, and the demise of priest Umbro makes the connotation of the mentioning even darker. While Paul tries to convey the sense of tension through the implication of the classical allusion he uses, Saint-Saëns hints at the danger of water through recycling the music from the first movement of the concerto. Near the end of the second part of the music, instead of continuing the sweet and song-like melodies, Saint-Saëns shifts his audience attention from the peaceful lake to the running waterfall nearby. The moment of tension shown here invokes the imagery of steep mountain rocks, which is captured by the main motif of the first movement of the Saint-Saëns violin concerto. In both instances, accent, a marking on a musical score that indicates that the musician should emphasize a particular note, is employed, and a violinist would achieve such result by putting more pressure on the bow and dragging it across the string with greater speed. The connection between these two passages of the music allows Saint-Saëns to bring the harshness of the rock into the fluid music of Andantino, so that the audience feels the power of water and the potential danger it possesses in those transitory moments. Compared to the threatening dangers lurking in the description of Lake Como, implied through classical references, this aggression in Saint-Saëns' work is less harmless yet equally frightening for the audience. By showing the water's aggression through musical accent, Saint-Saëns matures his Italian lake and exhibits the water's changeable character. Such invocation of the first movement of the concerto in Andantino also helps the audience to understand the movement in the context of the whole piece. The presence of French music in an Italian landscape shows the globalness of this composition and Saint-Saëns' experience as a traveler. just as the classical allusions of Lake Como that brings the readers to different ancient places. Such intersection of locality in Saint-Saëns' work reflects the composer's ambition in depicting a greater scope of nature. After a detailed characterization of nature, water, and its surrounding, both Paul and Saint-Saëns' work fall into a wistful space. At the end of Tu Lake Como, the poet concludes his prolonged discussion on the lake's allure and danger with a plea for the reader's prayer. In line 29 to 30, Paul conveys the prayer with a sense of urgency. Through the prayer, Paul shifts the narrative from a secular, more nature-focused perspective to a Christian and a personal one. However, the few short lines of poem at the end are unable to balance out lines of sensory descriptions of nature before. Such an imbalance is like a web that covers Paul's prayer, and it indicates the strong and irresistible allure that nature has for the poet. The spiritual ending of Tu Lake Como is also reciprocated in Saint-Saëns' violin concerto. When the first two parts of the second movement sticks to the structure of music from the classical era, Saint-Saëns provides a thought-provoking and ethereal ending. In this passage, Saint-Saëns boldly uses harmonic, a violin technique that plays overtones by touching the violin string with minimal pressure to deliver his final message. The delicate melody, progressing slowlier than ever, drags the reader from their floating boats into the air. While concertos composed in the Romantic era are known for their tender second movement, such as Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, the melody that Saint-Saëns creates here is different from the heavenly space that Mendelssohn constructed. The harmonics that Saint-Saëns employs here makes the musical space more fragile and tenuous, and the music gives the audience the feeling of suddenly becoming foam in the air. It is such threat of destruction that the audience feels that makes the musical imagery created by Saint-Saëns less realistic, and reminds us about the fictional nature of the lake in Andantino. The lyrical ending also elucidates the contradiction that Andantino poses to Saint-Saëns' personal belief that music is above feeling. When Saint-Saëns employs the Sicilian boat song in the main motif of the movement, the composer has already structured his music in a lyrical and emotional space. The genre of boat song has a deep root in the vernacular tradition of southern Italian region, and are composed because of strong feelings, which goes against Saint-Saëns' claim that art can be created without emotion. While Saint-Saëns wrote the ending with the intention of showing off Sarasate's impeccable violin skills, the harmonics managed to capture the delicate last ray of sunlight on the Italian lake, and perfectly recreates the audience's sense of longing to the Italian pastoral scenery during the day and a wish for revisiting the place. Through such perspective, the imbalanced, fragile poetic space in Paul the Deacon's Tu Lake Como are joined together with the beautiful yet ephemeral music space in Andantino. While Paul was afraid that the secular beauty of Lake Como would distract him away from the prayerful and spiritual realm of Christianity, Saint-Saëns is also concerned about any overindulgence in the sensational world of music and fearful for human emotions' intervention in the music's creation. For Paul the Deacon, nature is the token of earthly beauty. For Saint-Saëns, nature becomes the symbol of music. Both artists acknowledge the danger of natural allure, yet both of their works indicate wishes for the return to such spaces. While Paul implies that such tendency with explicit supplication to his readers. Saint-Saëns indicates the longing with a passage of sweet melodies performed by the woodwind at the end of Andantino. As a last ray of sunlight vanishes on the surface of the Italian lake, we also drift quietly out of the center of the water, carrying both the terrifying and the tender moments of the nature with us.